Susan Powell disappeared from her own home in the middle of the night. Her husband, Josh Powell, said he had left the house with their 2 young sons for a late-night camping trip in the Utah desert. When he returned, Susan was gone. There was no confirmed sighting of her after that night. Her purse, keys, and phone remained behind. Investigators found a wet area on the living room carpet, with fans blowing across it. And within days, the person who said he had last seen Susan alive had become the central figure in the investigation.
July 29th, 2008, covering all my bases, making sure that if something happens to me or my family or all of us, that our assets are documented.
But there was a problem. There was no body. And for more than 2 years, the investigation would continue without one. Susan Cox Powell was 28 years old when she disappeared from West Valley City, Utah, in December 2009. She was married to Joshua Powell and was the mother of 2 boys, Charlie and Braden. From the outside, the family could appear ordinary, but behind the scenes, the marriage had become increasingly troubled. Susan had discussed problems in the relationship with people close to her, and members of her family later described Josh as controlling. They said Susan had considered leaving if the relationship did not improve. Those allegations came from people who knew Susan, and they became part of the larger picture investigators were trying to understand. But on the night she vanished, none of that could answer the most immediate question: where was Susan? On Sunday, December 6th, Susan attended church with Josh and their 2 children. Later that afternoon, a neighbor, Giovanna Owings, spent time with the family. They ate pancakes and eggs. Susan was reportedly feeling unwell and eventually went to take a nap. Owings left the house at around 5 p.m. Josh later said he took the boys sledding. A neighbor reported seeing Josh return to the home at about 8:30 that evening. Then the timeline became much harder to explain. Josh later told police that shortly after midnight, around 12:30 a.m. on December 7th, he left the house with Charlie and Braden to go camping at Simpson Springs, a remote area in Utah's West Desert. According to his account, Susan was asleep when he left. The trip itself immediately became important. It was the middle of December. Temperatures were below freezing and snow was in the forecast. Josh told investigators he wanted to test a new generator. He had also reportedly told people that he disliked camping. That detail came from Susan's friend and was later included in police records. On its own, it did not establish what had happened to Susan. But investigators were not looking at one fact in isolation. They were reconstructing a night in which a woman disappeared without apparently taking the things she would normally need to leave her home. The following morning, Susan failed to show up for work. Her children also did not arrive at daycare. The daycare provider tried to reach the family and became concerned. Police were called to the Powell home. What investigators encountered there would become some of the earliest pieces of evidence in the case. Susan's purse was still there. Her keys were still there. Her cell phone was still there. And there was a wet spot on the living room carpet. According to contemporary reporting, 2 fans were blowing across the wet area when police entered the house. Susan's last known phone activity also helped narrow the timeline. Investigators later established that the last call from her phone was made at approximately 2:29 p.m. on December 6th to Giovanna Owings. That meant the mystery was not simply about where Susan had gone. Investigators had to determine what had happened inside the Powell home between her last confirmed contact with another person and Josh's departure with the children. Josh became a person of interest. He eventually hired an attorney and declined a third police interview. On December 15th, he provided a DNA sample. Police formally identified him as a person of interest around that time. For Susan's family, the search became a desperate effort to find her alive. Friends and relatives organized vigils. Volunteers searched. Susan's family used television appearances and social media to keep her disappearance in the public eye, but Josh and Susan's families were moving in very different directions. Josh left Utah with his sons and went to Washington to stay with his father, Stephen Powell. That move would eventually introduce investigators to another disturbing part of the story. In the meantime, Police continued searching. They seized the blue minivan Josh had driven around the time Susan disappeared. Investigators spent thousands of hours working the case. By August 2010, West Valley City Police said 5 of their 28 detectives were assigned full-time to Susan's disappearance, and investigators had spent at least 6,850 hours on the case. Still, there was no Susan. Then Josh and his father offered an explanation. They suggested Susan had not been murdered at all. Instead, they claimed she had run away with another missing Utah man, Stephen Kocher. Kocher had disappeared around the same time as Susan, and Josh and his father proposed that the two had left together, possibly traveling to Brazil and starting new lives. There was no confirmed evidence establishing that Susan had done this, but the theory added another layer to a case already filled with uncertainty. Investigators continued looking elsewhere. In August 2011, police announced what they described as a break in the case and searched abandoned mine shafts near Ely, Nevada. Nothing was found. Then, in September, investigators conducted another extensive search near Topaz Mountain in Utah's Joab County. Cadaver dogs were used. Investigators recovered pieces of charred wood that authorities said could potentially have been associated with the burning of a body, although the discovery did not produce Susan's remains. And while investigators were searching the desert, something else was happening in Washington. Police had searched the home of Josh and his father, Stephen Powell. The search produced computers, videos, photographs, Susan's childhood diaries, and other material. The investigation into Susan had now intersected with a separate investigation involving Stephen Powell. In September 2011, Stephen was arrested and charged with voyeurism and possession of child pornography. Authorities said evidence recovered from his home included recordings of women and girls made without their knowledge. Some of the material involved Susan. The discovery changed the environment surrounding Josh's 2 children. They were removed from Stephen Powell's home and placed into protective custody. A Washington court eventually awarded temporary custody of the boys to Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox. Josh's access to his children became the subject of a prolonged legal battle, and that battle would become the final chain of events leading to one of the most devastating moments in the entire case. Josh continued to maintain his position regarding Susan, but investigators had increasingly focused on him. Members of Susan's family had also become convinced that he knew more than he was saying. One of Josh's sisters, Jennifer Graves, publicly expressed the belief that her brother was responsible for Susan's disappearance. Another sister, Alina, would later dispute the suspicion and defend Josh. The family itself was divided. Meanwhile, Susan remained missing. There was still no murder charge. There was no body. There was no courtroom where the evidence against Josh could be presented to a jury. Instead, the investigation was increasingly taking place through searches, court proceedings, family disputes, and police records. And then the custody case produced a new development. In January 2012, Josh sought to regain custody of his sons. A court hearing followed. Investigators provided Washington authorities with digital material obtained during the Utah investigation. The court ultimately ordered Josh to undergo a psychosexual evaluation, while the boys remained with their maternal grandparents. The legal system was trying to determine whether Josh could safely have contact with his children. The answer would come only days later. On February 5, 2012, Josh had a court-ordered supervised visit with Charlie and Braden at his rental home in Washington. A social worker was present to supervise the visit. The boys entered the house. Josh shut the door, and then he attacked his sons and started a fire. The resulting explosion killed Josh and both children. According to court records, Josh had deliberately created a situation in which the house would ignite. The later federal court record described the event as Josh killing the boys during supervised visitation and taking his own life. The children were 7 and 5 years old. Josh was 36. And suddenly, one of the central figures in the Susan Powell investigation was dead. There would never be a trial. There would never be a confession. And there would never be an opportunity for prosecutors to confront Josh with the evidence they had accumulated. For Susan's family, however, the disappearance had not been solved, because Susan was still missing. The explosion brought enormous attention to questions about the decisions that had allowed Josh to have contact with his children. Susan's parents eventually sued Washington's Department of Social and Health Services and others, arguing that the state had failed to adequately protect their grandsons. The litigation became part of a much larger examination of what officials knew, what they had been told, and whether the decisions made during the custody proceedings were reasonable based on the information available at the time. A federal district court initially granted summary judgment to the state defendants. The Ninth Circuit later reversed in part, allowing negligence claims against DSHs to proceed, while upholding qualified immunity for the individual social workers. The legal dispute was complicated because hindsight was unavoidable. After the deaths, it was possible to look backward at every warning sign and ask why something more had not been done. But the courts also had to examine what officials actually knew before the murders and what decisions they could reasonably make with the information available at the time. That distinction matters, because the tragedy of February 5 was not evidence that every earlier decision was legally unreasonable, but it did expose how badly the system had failed to anticipate what Josh was capable of doing. The deaths also changed the investigation into Susan. West Valley City Police now had a suspect who could no longer be interviewed, prosecuted, or compelled to explain what had happened. If Josh had killed Susan, he had taken the answer with him. And investigators still had to find her. In 2013, West Valley City Police conducted another search in Oregon, looking for Susan's remains near Salem. Nothing was found. That same year, investigators announced that the active search for Susan was ending. Police said they believed Josh had killed Susan and that his brother Michael may have helped him conceal her body. But belief is not the same as a criminal conviction. Josh was never charged with Susan's murder. No jury ever heard the complete case against him. And Susan's body was never recovered. The legal proceedings surrounding the Powell family did not completely end there. Josh's brother Michael, who had publicly defended Josh, died by suicide in 2013. Stephen Powell's own legal troubles continued after his arrest. His case became separate from the question of what happened to Susan, although the material uncovered during the investigation provided another disturbing picture of the Powell family environment, and Susan's parents continued seeking answers. The disappearance also became a subject of scrutiny in Washington because of what happened to her children. Years later, a federal appeals court described the case in stark terms. Susan had disappeared in Utah. Josh, considered the lead suspect, moved to Washington with the boys, and 2 years later, he killed his sons during a supervised visit before taking his own life. That sequence is what makes the Susan Powell case so difficult to put into a simple category. It is a missing person investigation. It is a suspected homicide without a body. It is a custody case that ended in the deaths of 2 children. And it is a story in which the person investigators believed was responsible never stood trial. But there is another important distinction. The absence of a body does not mean there was no evidence. Investigators had Susan's belongings. They had the timeline. They had Josh's account of leaving for a late-night camping trip. They had evidence from the Powell home. They had searches across multiple locations. They had statements from people close to Susan. They had the subsequent behavior of the people surrounding the case. And they had years in which Josh remained the primary focus of suspicion. What they did not have was the one piece of evidence that would have transformed suspicion into a conventional homicide prosecution: Susan herself. Without her remains, investigators could not reconstruct the final moments of her life through forensic examination. They could not determine precisely where she died. They could not establish a definitive cause of death. And they could not give her family the certainty that comes from bringing someone home. The West Valley City Police Department continues to list Susan Marie Powell as a missing person and has said investigators believe Josh was responsible for her disappearance and death. Her remains have never been located. That leaves one question hanging over everything that happened after December 6th, 2009. What happened inside that house? We know Susan was there that day. We know she spoke with her friend. We know she was home in the afternoon. We know her phone stopped being used after her final known call. We know her purse, keys, and cell phone remained behind. And we know Josh later told investigators that he left the house with the boys while Susan was asleep. After that, Susan disappeared. Everything that followed, the searches, the accusations, the custody battle, the investigation into Stephen Powell, the deaths of Charlie and Braden, and Josh's suicide, happened without resolving that central mystery. Susan's family has had to live with that uncertainty for more than 16 years. There is no grave to visit, no confirmed final location, no trial transcript in which the person investigators believed responsible was forced to explain himself, and no final answer from Josh Powell. Only the evidence that remained after he was gone. For Susan Powell, the most important question has never changed. Where is she? And until that question is answered, the case is not really finished. If you want to follow more cases where the final clue is still missing, subscribe to The Final Clue.